Right? So you are noble if you make demands on yourself, if you have goals and expectations that you place on yourself and obligations that you place on yourself. That is noble, and hence an aspect of nobility. For Gasset, nobility is not the demands you place on others. And later he'll go in and he'll critique this sort of colloquial, sort of general sense of nobility as being noble by blood or birth or something like that. In no sense is he talking about nobility in that form. So, this is the life lived as discipline, the noble life. Nobility is defined by the demands it makes on us, by obligation, not by rights. Remember? Not by rights or desires, right? Not by rights, but by duty. So, the distinction between the two is that previously, society was based and defined by its role to satisfy obligations of its members, instead of making the demands of its members, right? This conception, according to Gasset, is a more altruistic, and I'll do another lecture on this. This is a more altruistic model, and this is a more egoistic model. This model is concerned more with others. This model is more concerned with self. And the distinctions go on and on and on. Okay. He then gives a quote, "To live as one likes is plebeian," right? Is to be a plebe, which is like insignificant. To live as one likes is plebeian. The nobleman aspires to order and law. So what the nobleman does, right, as opposed to the mass man, is that the nobleman confines himself to the discourse of things which he is proficient in, to the limitations and the rules set out by both ethical theory and legal theory, and he lives his life governed in that limitation, right, in that bracket. The mass man refuses to be bracketed, right? The mass man refuses any external limitation, and nor will he impose limitations on himself. So he's completely open to do whatever he likes without appeal to any authority or limitations by any authority. So you can see the possibility for destruction and the inherently destructive nature of the mass man. And not only the mass man, the product of which he is the massness itself. Okay. He then goes on to clarify what he means by nobility, right? And as I said before, by nobility, he does not mean this sort of general sense of being noble is being of blue blood or being of a noble birth. Like, what does that mean? Remember, what he's saying with respect to nobility is that an individual is noble insofar as an individual makes demands on him or herself. Insofar as I make demands on myself, and I posit or I set for myself a goal to accomplish, and I achieve that goal, I have attained some semblance of nobility by creating goals, creating obligations, restraining my desires, and focusing on something that I'm trying to actualize. That's nobility. Nobility isn't the following, right? So what he says is, it is annoying to see the degeneration suffered in ordinary speech by a word so inspiring as nobility. For by coming to mean for many people heredity, noble blood, it is changed into something similar to common rights, into a static, passive quality which is received and transmitted like something inert. This is where we now we understand what nobility is. Now he's going to tell us what inertia is, right? What does it mean to talk about inertia? And how does inertia correspond to this notion of nobility? All right. Well, with respect to inertia, you have to recognize that we have a very static, very sort of unchanging, unrefined continuum. This state of heredity, if you're talking about nobility as being your blood right, well, you became a noble and nothing changed, right? You were given this. It was like something you were afforded based on your genes or your birth. That's a very static sense of nobility, right? So that what we recognize is that he makes a distinction. Gasset makes this very interesting distinction. I'll do it this way. Actually, I'll do it this way. He makes a distinction between effort and inertia. Right. Okay. We recognize that when we're talking about the noble, right? When we're talking about the noble, we're talking about an individual who has assumed and accepted an obligation, right? The noble has accepted an obligation, and insofar as he's accepted this obligation, he recognizes, or she recognizes, the demands that has been placed on him or herself, right? So that anytime we're talking about effort, we're also talking about duty, right? We're talking about obligation, right? I'm making an obligation on myself. I'm imposing something outside of myself, and I'm using that imposition, that force, that motivating factor to sort of prod me along, to get me to the next point. With respect to this idea of being inert, we can see the difference. He says, for by coming to mean for many people heredity, noble blood, it being this idea of nobility, is changed into something similar to common rights, into a static passive quality which is received and transmitted like something inert. But the strict sense of the word nobility is essentially dynamic. Noble means the well-known, that is, known by everyone, famous. He who has made himself known by excelling the anonymous mass. It implies unusual effort. Right? So that we have this distinction now of effort and inertia. Right? So that we recognize that we have duty and obligation, but on the other hand, instead of having duty, instead of having obligation, we have limitless We have limitless possibility. This possibility is unrestrained. Right? It's unrestrained. Obviously, this is restrained by definition. So we have this idea of a duty-based, deontological, to be technical, meaning duty, or an ethic of obligation, which is restrained, as opposed to limitless possibility, which is itself unrestrained, right? I get to do whatever it is that I want to do. That's the first distinction. Obviously, then, we recognize that the next distinction between the two is one of the distinction between the excellent man and then the mass man. The excellent man and the common man. So that the excellent man appreciates effort, and the mass man refuses any obligation. He refuses to be obligated. He imposes obligation. He does not accept obligation, right? So that the excellent man assumes effort, the mass man refuses any effort. He imposes effort on others. The next thing to recognize is that, and I actually need to address this. I need to address this point. Is that there is a difference in how one responds to their environment, right? The man of effort is, as Gasset has said, active. He's active, right? The man of effort is active. He's continually changing. The mass man, this man of inertia, is passive. It's important to understand how we come about this. He himself isn't changing. He has his demands. His demands are fixed. He has his desires. His desires are limitless. His expectations of others are tantamount, right? His expectations of others to fulfill those desires are limitless. Everyone has an obligation to fulfill the desires of the mass man, But he himself is not doing anything. He himself is not creating.